Okay, we're back. We'll now go to the Planning Committee, and Jack Weiss is the chair.
Thank you, Gene. This afternoon we have one item. It's the overview of the 2016 Comprehensive Plan Update process, including draft growth alternatives for accommodating projected growth using the 2036 growth forecast adopted by the city and the county. Sitting on the committee with me is Dan Hamill and Terry Borneman. We are in minute 15 of our 25-minute presentation, and I'm going to turn it over to Rick Seppler, our planning
Actually,
director.
Jack, I think I'll start.
To Greg Arcott.
And we'll try and move through this quickly. Greg Arcott, Planning Department. What I wanted to do was provide a little context for today's discussion prior to turning it over to Lisa and Rick to do the bulk of the presentation. So as council knows, state law requires the city to have a comprehensive plan and that it be updated periodically. Our current plan was adopted in 2006, and we have to update that plan by June of 2016. So we have about a year and a half to get this work done. Under the GMA, we are required to update the plan in really three basic areas. The first is to address any changes that have occurred in state law since 2006 when our plan was adopted. So, for example, one of those changes is we're now required to review our zoning around the airport to make sure that we're not allowing land uses that are incompatible with the operation of the airport. And that's a new requirement that we need to address this time. The second area is we need to review and update our critical areas ordinance. We have to incorporate best available science provisions into that ordinance, and while we feel that our CAO already does that, to a large extent, we have proposed some minor revisions to the CAO. The Planning Commission is discussing those revisions even as we speak, and those will be coming to Council very soon. And finally, we have to update the plan to incorporate the new population and employment growth forecasts that the county approved last year. Our current plan looks out to year 2022. The updated plan has to look out to year 2036. So it's a 20-year plan, more or less. In conjunction with this update, we have to review our urban growth area boundaries. We do that work with the county. And that's probably the area where we'll spend the majority of our time. And that's essentially where and how we grow is the subject of today's work session, really. We're in the process, staff is in the process of developing options for the community and the Planning Commission and the Council to consider with respect to where and how we grow. In doing that, we're looking at our current land supply, trying to figure out how much population growth we can accommodate and how many new jobs we can accommodate, given the boundaries that we have currently and the zoning that we have in place. So we'll compare what the capacity figures show we can accommodate against the growth projections and see how those two balance or not. We'll be looking at the public facilities and services that will be needed to accommodate that growth. So how many additional police officers might we need? What kind of changes to our sewer and water systems might be needed? How many additional acres of parkland are we going to need to accommodate that growth? So that's part of our review as well. And we're looking also at the environmental impacts of growing in different parts of the city and the UGA. We don't have the answers to those questions. We don't have all the data yet. And we're not expecting you to make any recommendations at this point. We're just providing you with an update. We're going to provide you with some observations that we've made to this point, the work that we've been doing, and we'll highlight the next steps for you. Okay? So with that, I will turn it over to Lisa.
Good afternoon, Lisa Poole with the Planning Department. As Greg stated, we did conduct, or the city adopted growth and population forecasts last year, and those forecasts indicate that we need to plan for approximately 36,000 additional people and 23,000 additional jobs by 2036. Staff's land capacity analysis indicated that population demand will exceed the current supply by approximately 30,000 people during this period. This equates to about 1,500 housing units. So where will these people live and work? There are several options, and those include infill within the current city and UGA boundaries, primarily directed at new urban villages and along high-capacity transit corridors. We can encourage or require higher development densities within our UGA and recently annexed areas. We can expand our UGA into targeted areas, a combination of any of these, or we can revise our forecasts to reflect smaller growth allocations. Many factors need to be considered for each of these options. Specific to infill, as you know, compact mixed-use communities have many benefits, including reduced auto dependency and reduced public infrastructure costs. The city has put in a whole host of incentives and programs that support infill, such as the Infill Toolkit, bonus densities, multifamily tax exemption program, design review, and more that will come before you in the future. The majority of this infill is directed toward our mixed-use urban villages, including downtown, the waterfront, and Old Town. Even with this concerted effort, some of these strategies have been implemented with limited success when applied within our existing single-family neighborhoods due to character concerns and traffic impacts. And some of the urban villages have been slow to mature. Staff continues to have confidence in this approach, but we acknowledge that it will take time. Regarding UGA expansion, obviously that would provide additional land to accommodate growth while easing densification pressures. Considerations with this approach include new infrastructure and the associated costs, as well as the community's desire for compact, mixed-use, walkable areas, and we also need to consider our demographic shifts, including the aging community. So, and staff is not wedded to any of these approaches at this time, and that's what Rick will talk about next, is our approach to moving forward and how to determine our UGA boundaries.
Members of the council, I'll preface my remarks by saying while we may have differences on choosing the best path to proceed forward on, we should all work from the same facts. And where we are now is staff is assembling the best set of facts they can to bring forward to frame that discussion. I should note that nothing in your packets is a recommendation today, as noted by both my colleagues. These are just observations as we work to assemble that record, to assemble the materials. Our operative plan is to assemble the materials, but they can only be truth and tempered by public involvement. So once we get our arms around the facts, what we know to be true, what we have a sense of our growth potentials, service extension, impacts that we can anticipate for natural systems or try to avoid. We need to bring that information forward, and the way we do that typically is to craft a number of straw person, I guess for lack of a better word, alternatives. I should note that none of the alternatives provided to you is the preferred alternative by staff. They're to frame our discussions, and we anticipate a final recommendation coming before you from the Planning Commission to be a mix and match of elements that are contained in the drafts, elements that we haven't even considered yet that might be forwarded by community members or by the Planning Commission themselves, or elements that ultimately you will temper to best meet the ends of the community. That being said, we wanted to stop and give you a progress report so you understand the context of how we proceed to do the work. Where we are now, as I mentioned, was working very diligently to do the dutiful technical analysis that precedes any meaningful planning process. In doing that, we are looking more than just in assessing the numbers. We're looking in the reality of what could be accommodated in the various areas of our community. For example, one could look at lower density areas and say we'll just up the density there. If there are significant constraints in terms of infrastructure, or if the cost of infrastructure is so great that it would likely never occur, we need to identify that. It's perhaps you win the battle, but you lose the war. We need to truth those things so that you understand the consequence of land use designations and densities, so you act from a position of what is likely to occur rather than what is theoretical to occur. We are also working with both Parks and Public Works, waiting for the result of a wetland study. I think Council is aware. It's looking at the northerly portion of the city and the UGA. It's the first comprehensive assemblage of the information that's been prepared regarding the wetland characterizations. We think this is critical before we take any exercises forward to understand the limitations or even opportunities that might be present. It's the best data we'd have on that area, and it warranted the study. Additionally, the Planning Commission, as noted in your packet, has asked for a number of good background materials ranging from metrics to assess the success of an urban village straight on through to an assessment of the ongoing work for incentives to see if it could be directed and encouraged. And again, those are pieces of the puzzle that are necessary so that one might be able to make a reasoned conclusion on how to proceed. What I can say is that we hope in the next 60 days to have much of this information well crafted to the point where we can go to the public with it, hold open houses, seek input, and then from that, work together to prepare alternatives we can bring forward to the Planning Commission and ultimately to this body. As Council is aware, these are legislative matters as opposed to quasi-judicial, and your participation is welcome in the process. We'd encourage you to attend, if possible, the open houses just to hear from community members and others, and we will share with you the correspondence we receive. I should note that there is a studied urgency about proceeding. We have a deadline of June of 2016. Winning the race by just completing the comp plan by that date is a Pyrrhic victory. Winning the race by completing that date with something that ultimately can be implemented and achieved is a true legacy for the community, and that's what we're striving for. My colleagues and I would be happy to answer any questions about the process or our observations to date.
Thank you, Rick. Committee members? Any thoughts? So we're going to have the public process prior to the Planning Commission getting another bite at this apple. Then
we've been talking about that. We have information we need to bring to the Planning Commission, much as we're doing to you today, but we do see an opportunity for a public open house and workshop. We have talked about that. To get broader representation, hear different points of view, things of that nature. And although it's not been scheduled, it's dependent on how we proceed with the existing studies.
Okay, Terry?
Yeah. When we're looking, when we're looking at population projections and meeting those population projections, you talked about the areas like Samish Way, Old Town, not living up to their potential yet or whatever. When we look at how much growth can be accommodated in those areas, in theory, is that the number that we're looking at, that they should be able to accommodate, and that way it counts against that number? Or is it how many are actually there? Because I know it's much easier to go into a single-family neighborhood and say, oh, we're going to change the zoning on that to allow detached accessory dwellings. It's easier to get someone to build there, even though it screws up the neighborhood, than it is right now in some of our other areas that we have that has the space, that has the ability and the infrastructure to be able to put it there. But some people are more reluctant to do that. So how's that work in terms of counting towards that number?
That's one of the issues we're working on. What is the reasonable absorption in the planning period for the urban villages? It would be too convenient just to say all growth would go there, we could meet any number. The truth is, what could we carry? What's the likelihood and timing of it? I should note that community development is working along with a number of policies already approved by this council to incentivize and encourage development in those areas. We're factoring that in. Growing urban villages is not a precise science. We do have some comparable size developments in other communities in the Northwest, so looking to those. And when we come back to you, it will be a refined estimate of what really we could accommodate in 20 years and what the timeline might be for it to move forward. Because that's a significant assumption on our comp plan population.
But if we limit some of the movement towards expanding more into the single-family neighborhood with some of the alternatives that have been kind of pushed back against some of the neighborhoods, if we limit those kind of things and make it harder to develop there, doesn't that put more incentive then in the areas there, that you can develop?
In theory, the market will look to find places to provide services.
Right.
We
if
need
housing's needed.
Right, and we need to provide a full range of housing type. So we not only need to look at higher density, multifamily, we need to look at moderate density and residential too. And then look at the opportunities we have. And that's exactly the kind of research we're working on now.
So, Roxanne?
I swear I'm not a conspiracy theory person when I say this, but I've been talking with a lot of our scientific friends, and I really am concerned about the migration that we're going to have in our community over time due to water drying up in places like Colorado, Texas, Arizona. And so I just really can't support this future development enough. Not that I want to absorb all of those people in our community, but I think the demand to live in our great community is going to increase over time.
As I understand it, we're seeing the first waves of climate refugees from the Southwest coming to the Northwest. And it's a trend that's emerging. There's not a great deal of study on it, but it has been noted.
So I guess I have a question associated with the UGAs itself, and I've asked it in the past, but I just want to get a check-in on this. The county council years ago went and did a review in the Geneva neighborhood, and they did kind of a surgical modification of their boundaries depending on what specifically was going on with each one of those parcels. And my question is are we going to be doing something similar with our UGAs as part of this overall review, or are we just simply going to go and just cut a straight line over and call it good the way we have in the past in version 1.0?
We'll be looking at both land within our existing UGA to see what the characteristics of it are and how easy it'll be to serve. So we'll be looking at both land within our existing UGA to see if it's still appropriate for urban levels of development, and also some areas outside of the existing UGA that we might be able to expand into. So those will be part of the alternatives that we bring to you. And changes to the UGA boundary don't necessarily mean just expansions. They might mean contractions in some areas as well.
And then a follow-up to that has to do with the original understanding that each city was going to do a capital facilities review of specifically what was it going to cost for the infrastructure associated with those UGAs and whether or not it could actually be supported. I mean, we found out in what we call now the UGA Reserve in U Street that wasn't practical financially to support the infrastructure that was necessary to incorporate, to annex. Are we doing that in a very, are we doing this in a blanket process, or are we doing this, kind of in a much more narrower, block by block approach? And are the other cities doing the same so that we can be kind of apples to apples with their approach?
I'm not really familiar with what all of the other cities are doing. We are looking at the capital facility needs that would be required to accommodate growth and to annex these UGAs, and we're doing it geographically as much as is possible. We do know that Council in the past has asked us to look specifically at the Geneva and Hillsdale areas, portions of the UGA and the watershed, to look at what the costs of annexing those specific areas would be, and we will be doing that work as well.
And Alderwood, too.
Alderwood is a little more difficult because it would be part of a much larger conceivably part of a much larger annexation. But yeah, we can look at that area as well.
Okay. Okay, I think maybe for right now, especially given the nature of this, we might want to go and have another planning committee meeting in the morning where we could have a little bit more time to talk about more specific details. But I think for your initial update, this is great, and we can call it good now unless you have anything else to add.
If I might, I just suggest that we'd welcome that, and we'd look to schedule it so we can have more conversation, talk about some of the approaches we're doing. There are multiple fronts we're trying to fill the information on. We can give you the idea of what that would be, the totality. Sure.
And I guess for legal, Peter, and also you, Rick, is there anything prohibiting our planning committee with having a joint meeting with the planning commission associated with just talking?
It's legislative, and it could be scheduled. It might be a good opportunity as we develop alternatives to talk about them, but it's not prohibited.
Okay.
I think years ago, the council met with the planning commission a couple times, many years ago, but that's a good idea.
I just throwing
No,
it
the
out
committee,
as a
that's a good idea.
Yeah.
Good idea.
Okay. With that, end of the committee.
Hey, thank you, Jack.
Thank you, Rick. Thank you.